Good morning. Glad you're all here this morning. We're getting in bigger groups in the mornings. This is a good thing. We're going to be looking at Obadiah this morning. A little bit different approach because we're going to, a lot of times we jump into these books and just start going, but this morning I want to take a look at some of the background of this so that we understand where the prophet's coming from and what's happening here in this book. But let's bow for a moment in a word of prayer. Almighty Father, we thank you for the opportunity we have to gather together this morning, to have this place to gather together as your children, to open your word and to be able to study it. Father, just open our hearts and our souls as we study your word this morning, that we can see your will and your way for us in our lives. Be with us as we study. These things we ask in your name. Amen. Now, as we look at Obadiah, you would think, okay, it's the shortest book in the New Testament. We ought to know it pretty well, but unfortunately, it's one of those small ones that oftentimes gets passed over. And because it was written to who it's written to and what happened to them, as we'll see this morning, we often don't pay too much attention to it. So we're going to look at it a little bit this morning. The first verse of Obadiah, it says, "The vision of Obadiah, thus says the Lord God concerning Edom. We have heard a report from the Lord, and the messenger has been sent among the nations, saying, Arise, and let us rise up against her for battle." So this first verse identifies that Obadiah the prophet is writing this message, this vision to Edom. What do we know about Edom? Who are the Edomites? Esau's descendants, exactly. So when we start thinking about Esau and Esau's descendants, we kind of also then think about the story of Jacob and Esau a little bit, don't we? What do we know about Jacob and Esau? Esau handed his birthright. What's the significance of that? What's the significance of the birthright? Okay, the inheritance, the firstborn, which Esau was, had the birthright and would inherit the properties of the father. And what happened with it? Esau?
Well, he got hungry, so he sell it all for coffee.
His statement was, what good is this birthright if I'm dead? Because I'm hungry. Didn't care much about it, so he just sold off the birthright. And then later on, what happens? Okay. But what happened with Esau? Yeah, the blessing. What happened with that? Same thing, the birthright and the interesting thing about this, when you think about it, and oftentimes we think of this story and don't think of it all, but we should. This was God's plan. Rebecca knew it when it came time for the blessing and all of that, and God had talked to her, and all the way along it was to be Jacob that would be the descendant that was favored. So we think about that. But what happened later on in their lives? Yeah, Jacob was going, he was traveling, he was afraid to meet Esau. And then when they got together, then Esau hugged him, kissed him, and forgave him. So as we look at this story of Edom, I mean, it started way back there with the brothers and stuff, but they reconciled. But there's problems with the Edomites and the nation of Edom that come later on, and it may have been the descendants still holding a grudge because Esau didn't, but apparently the descendants at some point in time did. Kind of the historical setting for this, somebody open up to 2 Chronicles Chapter 21. we'll look back a little bit in history and look at some of the things that Edom's done, setting the stage for what we see in this book. 2 Chronicles 21, verses 4 through 10, it says, "Now when Jehoram was established over the kingdom of his father, he strengthened himself and killed all his brothers with the sword, and also others of the princes of Israel. Jehoram was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. And he walked in the ways of the king of Israel, just as the house of Ahab had done. For he had the daughter of Ahab as a wife, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Yet the Lord would not destroy the house of David because of the covenant that he had made with David, since he had promised to give a lamp to him and to his sons forever. In his days, Edom revolted against Judah's authority and made a king over themselves. So Jehoram went out with his officers and all his chariots with him, and he rose by night and attacked the Edomites, who had surrounded him, and the captains of the chariots. Thus Edom has been in revolt against Judah's authority to this day. At that time, Libnah revolted against his rule because he had forsaken the Lord God of his fathers." So here we see the Edomites again revolting against Jehoram, who was not a nice person anyway. So there's separation between Judah and Edom back into this time. Ultimately, Jehoram was ousted. Things didn't end well for him. But his descendants of Esau, as we go down through this and we see Judah and Israel and Edom, you have to believe that the Edomites, because they're the descendants of Esau, knew of the blessings in that Abraham, the covenant that was made with Abraham, and knowing that things were going to happen the way they were, should be supportive of Israel. But it doesn't appear they were ever that way for a long time. Continuing and looking at the past of this in Numbers chapter 20, verses 14 through 21. Numbers 20, 14 through 21. At least I didn't ask you to look for Obadiah yet, right? Numbers 20, 14 through 21. Charles, do you have that?
Moses sent messengers to Kadesh to the king of Edom. Thus says your brother Israel, you know all the hardships that we have met. Our fathers went down to Egypt, and we lived in Egypt a long time. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and our flocks. And when we cried to the Lord, we heard our voice and sent an angel and brought us out of Egypt. Here we are in Kadesh, a city on the edge of your territory. Please let us pass through your land. We will not pass through your field or vineyard or drink water from the well. We will go along the king's highway. We will not turn aside to the right hand or to the left until we have passed through your territory. But Edom said to him, you shall not pass through, lest I come out with the sword against you. And the people of Israel said to him, we will go up by the highway, and if we drink of your water, I and my livestock, then I will pay for it. And we only pass through on foot, nothing more. But he said, you shall not pass through. Edom came out against them with a large army and with a strong force. Thus Edom refused to give Israel passage through his territory. So Israel turned away.
Just another example here. We back in the time of Moses, and they're trying to get through and travel on, and Edom will not let them pass through their territory. Some animosity here. I mean, you think about it, and they know the promise of this covenant. They know what's happening with Israel and all of this, and they refuse to let them go through. So with this stuff in background and knowing where the Edomites were and what they've done, and we'll see some more of what they've done when we look at the book of Obadiah, the prophet was commissioned by God to preach judgment on Edom And that's what we see in the book that we see today. The pride in their victory is going to be short-lived, we're going to see. The security that they feel living where they live up in the mountains is going to be shattered. And they're ultimately going to be cut off, basically forever. Rome defeated both the Jews and the Edomites in about AD 70, and while some individuals survived, the nation of Edom as a whole pretty much was destroyed, fulfilling the prophecy that we'll see. But Obadiah talks more than that. When we get into this, he talks about the judgment against Edom, but he also talks about the restoration of the nation of Israel, of Jacob's descendants, and goes on to talk about judgment on the rest of the nations as well. So with these thoughts in mind, kind of a background that we often miss when we think about Edom and Obadiah, this kind of a feud has been going on for centuries, apparently. And here God is telling them that this feud is going to be over pretty soon. And we've got 21 verses here. We'll kind of get the oversight. Now, let's not do the oversight. Let's go, because we're going to go through this section by section anyway. If somebody would read verses 1 through 4 in Obadiah. So Obadiah starts off by explaining the judgment that's to be coming. What's going to happen to Edom? Going to be brought down. We'll find out a little bit more later about how they're going to be brought down. She will be despised. Not only will they be brought down, but will be despised, right? What is part of the issue that they have here? Why are they going to be judged or brought down? Among other things that we're going to find here in a minute, but arrogance, pride. In spite of all of the things that we've seen in the verses that we read earlier, and the things we're going to read here, they're sitting up in their mountains going, hey God, hey people, what are you going to do about it? And what does God say? Who's still in charge? Right? You who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? God says, oh, I'll do it. So that's the judgment has been declared. So they will be made small among the nations, and she will be utterly despised. Continuing on in verses 5 through 9. Scott, have you got that? So, what do you think of this judgment? What's going to happen to them?
It's not good. It's
bad enough that that says if thieves come to you and robbers by night, wouldn't they have stolen till they had enough? That's not going to be the case here apparently, right? It's going to be everything. Or if grape gatherers come to you, would they not have left some gleanings? This is going to be total and absolute and complete. And who's going to do it? God. But in this real world, who's going to do it?
Well, it will be Jerusalem that will come upon them, but this is God saying, I'm the one going to do it, making it very clear that His hand.
Is it strangers? Says your confederacy, or your friends, or people that you know, or people that eat your bread. It's going to be people they know. It's not strangers that are going to destroy them. It's going to be, I mean, they're so bad that people that they suppose are their friends are not going to be their friends. Will I not in that lay even destroy the wise men from evil? Everybody's going to be destroyed. And ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, that did happen. Rome came in and pretty much destroyed them. There might have been a few individuals that got out of there. What's going to be left of them? Not a whole lot of anything, right? So what do we think about this? Do you think that's fair?
Up to now, there's been only arrogance given as the reason. But as we see in our readings after this, the real items list of reasons come now. And God always tells you what will happen and why.
Yeah. And, you know, people want to say, well, did they really deserve all that? Well, that's up to God, right? We're not the judges. He goes on, as Scott mentions a little bit here in the next few verses, and kind of defends that judgment that's been made. This is going to be total and complete, but in verses 10 through 14, he talks about the things that they've done and why they deserve this judgment. In verse 10 it says, for violence against your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. In the day that you stood on the other side, in the day that strangers carried captive his forces, when foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, even you were as one of them. But you should not have gazed on the day of your brother in the day of his captivity, nor should you have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor should you have spoken proudly in the day of distress. You should not have entered the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Indeed, you should not have gazed on their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. You should not have stood at the crossroads to cut off those among them who escaped, nor should you have delivered up those among them who remained in the days of distress. Sounds like they had a whole laundry list of things that God says that they did. Violence against your brother Jacob was one thing. Apparently, they even joined forces with those that were going against Jerusalem. Because it says that you stood on the other side. And then there were people captured, and they entered Jerusalem. Apparently they looted Jerusalem. I mean, they were just, look at that laundry list of you should not have. What kinds of things did God say you should not have done? Okay, so when they took this and were destroying and fighting in Jerusalem, and some of the people escaped, apparently the Edomites were there and were cutting them off as they were trying to escape. Okay, what else should they have not have done? Rejoiced in it, right. And not only did they rejoice in it, well, what did they do after we talked about the arrogance just a minute ago? They did it proudly, right? What else should they have not done? Entered the gate. So apparently they went in with the forces that were invading. So they were on the opposite side even. And stood back and gazed on the affliction in the day of their calamity, Laid hands on their substance. So what does that mean? Yeah. Yeah, they went into Target and took TVs.
They pretty much won the game, because when you start at verse 11, it says, on the day that you stood aloof. That means that when they needed your help, you stood aside and didn't. But then when they were being looted and conquered, you took part in that, jumped in there, stole their wealth and all of that. So they not only, failed to help when they were in distress, but they took advantage of them.
Clear back in the days of Moses, they wouldn't let them cross the land, and now they've crossed the line and gone to the other side, gone to the dark side, so to say, right?
And God makes it clear that this, your brother Jacob, holding them accountable for the descendants of Esau, because he says, these are your brothers.
Yeah.
You turned away.
And you turned away, cut them off. Nor should you have delivered up those among them who remained in the day of distress. So not only did they cut them off on the road, then apparently they captured some of them and turned them over to the enemy forces. So as we look at some of these things and what they did, it's easy to look at it and say, well, they were who they were, and they should not have done those things. Are there lessons and warnings in there for us today? What do we need to be careful of? Pride and arrogance. Watching and not helping.
Separating ourselves. It says here, you were aloof, and on the other side, they put themselves there. And he's chastising them for that. You should not have done that.
Can we do that?
If we do, then we place enmity between us and God.
And how do we do that today?
Not following his commandments is one thing. Showing arrogance and pride, doing it our way, that's one way we get into trouble. But it's the actions that have come about because of that attitude that really show up on the way.
Are there ways that we can be guilty today of gloating over someone else's misfortune? And it may not even be somebody that you know or that's close, or in these instances, look at what they did and how they did it. We need to be a little bit careful of that as well. They may be a Christian, they may not be a Christian, but we have no right to stand back and gloat because something bad has happened to them. We're in the same boat that these people
So
were.
if Nancy Pelosi, Trish, and Paul, we can gloat.
Exactly. It might be your enemies, but be careful. No more political. We won't go any farther than that. But yeah, good example. Yes, yes, yes.
Carrie, in verse 7, it says that you won't detect it. Does that mean it's just going to be happening and you won't even realize it? Like it's just, you're so oblivious to the truth that it's just all around you, you just don't even see it.
Oh, where it ends up saying, and no one is aware of it?
Yeah, I mean, your friends are eating your bread and you're in the it, and it's just, isn't that sad or something? I mean, like you're just going about your business and you don't even realize it.
Well, I think, it's part of it is because of their pride, that they are where they are and they're in the mountains and they're telling God who's going to bring me down and nobody can touch us. And he's saying, oh yes, they will. You may not be aware of it right now, but it's going to be your friends and your allies that are going to do it.
They're already in the camp, but you don't know it.
You don't know it. You think they're your friends, but you've alienated people for so many years that who you think are your friends are not your friends.
Terry, we need to be watchful at all times, anybody. I mean, be on our guard. I don't mean just, like this, but we need to be watchful and be careful, even with our friends.
And you need to be treating people right. You need to be treating people as Christ would treat people, which is not being judgmental, which is not gloating against them, which is not going into the city and looting and doing all of the things that these people did. Exactly. So we need to be careful of that. The lesson for us in Obadiah is we can't be Edomites.
That same pattern we see again and again. I mean, if you watch just a simple movie, you can see that comrades who are doing wrong, in their pride and arrogance, put trust in one another, that fails them.
Yep.
One guy stabs the other guy in the back because their character, their pride, and their arrogance is not godlike. It's not selflessness. It's selfishness. And so here we see that Edom got in bed with the wrong group. And the prophet Obadiah is now telling him, even your friends aren't your friends. They're going to bring you down.
And it seems to be that and I don't know, I didn't study enough on it, whether it gets into farther in Numbers and in any other places here about where we see that in the time of Jehoram, or whatever the name was there, where he was bad, so Edom left, and apparently somewhere in there they started going down the wrong way. Moses comes later, and they won't even let them pass through their land. And somewhere here, along with, we see this in Israel and all the way along, where they kind of wander on different paths, but Edom has kind of gone off on its own for some time in a bad direction. So they're going to face this judgment. The first 15 verses and maybe verse 16 that we'll look at in a minute here are primarily directed towards Edom and a judgment and a defense of that judgment, and why God is pointing out you really deserve what's going to happen to you because you've earned it. And then later on, it goes down in verse 17 and 18, and it talks about Jacob, and it kind of moves on to judgment in other places. But in verse 15 it says, "For the day of the Lord upon all the nations is near. As you have done, it shall be done to you. Your reprisal shall return upon your own head. For as you drank on my holy mountain, so shall all the nations drink continually. Yes, they shall drink and swallow, and they shall be as though they had never been." Chrissy mentioned the golden rule. Kind of the same sort of thing here, right? As you have done, it'll be done to you. Treat people as you would like to be treated, because God is saying, as you have done, it shall be done to you. Your reprisal we should turn upon your own head. Be careful how you live, right? Be careful how you live. What does it mean when it talks about, as you drank my holy mountain, so all the nations shall drink continually? What are they drinking? It's metaphorical. It's God's wrath, right? They'll be drinking God's wrath. They'll all go drink it. They'll swallow. It'll be as it had never been. So other nations, other people will be doing this as well. And it says, "For the day of the Lord upon all the nations is near." What is the day of the Lord? Judgment. We know judgment's going to come. It's coming. It's near. Be careful. As you have done, it will be done to you. Don't be like the Edomites. They're getting this retribution, right? Verse 17 and 18 says, "But on Mount Zion there shall be deliverance, and there shall be holiness. The house of Jacob shall possess their possessions. The house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, but the house of Esau shall be stubble. They shall kindle them and devour them, and no survivor shall remain of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. So it's going to be pretty complete, isn't it? But within this, we see about the destruction and the stubble and everything else of Esau. There is redemption, isn't there? It says the house of Jacob, there will be redemption. This was God's plan all the way along. And the house of Jacob will possess their possessions. And the house of Joseph a flame. So God's plan is going to come to effect. And remember back when we had talked about that inheritance and the blessing? Was to who? Was to Jacob, right? The fulfillment of those promises, clear back then, are going to be coming, and they'll have redemption, and it will be saved, because that's what God has promised them is going to happen. A couple of other things that we'll look at here for just a minute. If somebody would look up Malachi chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, and somebody else, Scott, if you would look up Romans chapter 9, verses 10 through 13. That way I don't have to wonder about who's looking up what there. But Malachi 1 through 5, if somebody's got that one, if you would read Malachi 1 through 5.
The burden of the word of the Lord to Israel by Malachi. I have loved you, says the Lord. Yet you say, in what way have you loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, says the Lord? Yet Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. And laid waste to his mountains and his heritage for the jackals of the wilderness. Even though Edom has said, you have been impoverished, but we will return and build the desolate places. Thus says the Lord of hosts, they may build, but I will throw down. It shall be called the territory of wilderness. And the people against whom the Lord have indignation forever. For I shall see, and you shall say, the Lord has magnified beyond the border of his word.
So here we see the prophet Malachi talking about Esau and about Edom. And then in Romans chapter 9, verses 10 through 13.
It says, and not only this, but there was Rebekah also, when she had conceived twins by one man, our father Isaac. For though the twins were not yet born and had not done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose according to his choice might stand, not because of works, but because of him who called. It was said to her, the older will serve the younger, just as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated.
So we see in Malachi, we see the talk about Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. Edom is said will be impoverished. It goes back kind of the same sort of thing we've seen in Obadiah here, that Esau's descendants in Edom will be destroyed. But then we see in Romans 10, or Romans 9 here, what is the purpose of that? According to what we see in Romans. It's God's will. I mentioned that earlier. This is God's will. It says that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him who calls. So this, God knew this. God said Jacob will be, we'll get the birthright. We'll do all of this.
But what we need to keep in mind is, a lot of people say, well, then Esau didn't have a chance to begin with. Joseph, not Joseph, but Jacob ended up with it because he was a favorite of the Lord. What we got to understand is that Esau made his own decision. God didn't make that decision for him. He made that decision. And thus he suffered the consequences. decisions to his advantage, but we make the decisions, he doesn't make them for us.
This was according to God's will, but as Charles mentioned, did God force Esau to take that bowl of soup and trade his birthright?
And we also have to, remember that the scriptures say that your Creator knows he knows the very hairs on your head. The idea God knows. He knows how Esau's going to be. Doesn't mean he makes the decision for it or predicts ahead of time what it will be. But he knows how people's hearts and their character are.
And
He says, I loved Jacob, but I hated Esau. It's because of their deeds and their heart that he said.
it wasn't that God hated Esau from the day he was born. It's because of the actions throughout Esau's life, and you could spend a lot of time studying the story of Esau and his life and Jacob, and we didn't get into all of that, but there were reasons now that God is stating, I hated Esau. And to Charles' point here, he did not force Esau to sell that birthright. He did not force Jacob to put on the hairy arms and all of this stuff to go and steal the blessing. Those were choices they made. And we look at it and you say, well, God's plan eventually is that Jacob would get this inheritance. At some point in time, in some way, Esau would have made that choice. Whether it was on this day for a day of soup, bowl of soup, or whether it was some other time in his life, Esau was going to make that choice and lose the birthright. Didn't matter when that choice was made, it was going to happen.
I have a question. Now, this is probably not what it is worth. Is it that when they met, Jacob's group of people that he was traveling with, all of his possessions, came across the crossroads and heard that Esau was coming forth to meet him, and he was fearful. And finally that great meeting comes, and Jacob comes up ready to humble himself and tell him all this stuff, and he pulls him to his feet, hugs him. Esau forgave him. He did the right thing at that moment. There was reconciliation between Esau and Jacob, but it didn't end up that way.
Well, and I
it seems
mentioned,
God holding someone to account because your brother Jacob was in distress and calamity, and you turned your back on him.
well, and as I mentioned earlier, I said, they had a reconciliation here. But somewhere now, there are descendants of Esau beyond that knew of the promise made to Abraham, and that this would come down and they would enter the promised land and inherit the promised land and all of this stuff. And I have to believe that there was some enmity between the descendants and Israel, as we saw with Moses, as we saw in other places here where they took part in a destruction. There's got to be some things that not necessarily Esau, but in the minds of those descendants, they were still thinking they were wronged, that they lost out on the inheritance because of resentment. Another thing to be careful of, don't carry on those resentments for centuries and for years.
We just grow, we just grow and grow and grow.
And carries on, and you set yourself up in the mountain and say, who's going to do something about it? And God says, oh yeah, I think we can fix that. Verse, see, where were we here? Lost my place. Yeah, we went through 17 and 18, didn't we? Yeah. Huh?
Yeah.
I said, no, I read 17 and 18, but on Mount Zion there shall be deliverance. No, I guess it didn't. There shall be holiness. Yeah, the house of Jacob shall possess their possessions. So yeah, the reward, and Esau will be stubble. So now we're done.
119.
19 to 21, the last verses. If somebody wants to read those?
Thou shalt possess the mountain of Esau, and the lowland shall possess Philistia. They shall possess fields of Edom, and the fields of Samaria. Benjamin shall possess Gilead, and the captives of this host of the children of Israel shall possess the land of the Canaanites, as far as Zephalah. The captives of Jerusalem who are in Shepherd at Tebet shall possess the cities of the south. And Sabor shall come to Mount Zion to judge the mountain of Esau, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's.
So ultimately, God's will be done and the kingdom shall be the Lord's. This is talking about what's going to happen. Verse 20, it talks about the captives of this host of the children of Israel shall possess the land of the Canaanites. Remember the Abrahamic covenant that they would enter the promised land, inherit the promised land. Well, Jacob's descendants is talking about here will be possessing the land of the Canaanites, and it talks about the division of some of these other things in here as well. So as we look at this and it says that this is going to be what happens, why is this important when you think in the greater scheme of things? I mentioned it a minute ago, I almost slipped. Because it's the fulfillment of God's prophecy down to Abraham. The inheritance, we go back to the inheritance and the blessing and all of these things that happened earlier. This is the fulfillment of God's will that we read about here that in Romans chapter 9, that the purpose of God according to election might stand. Fulfillment of God's prophecy is that this would happen, and this is happening now, here.
When these prophets spoke, it was as much for the people of Israel as it was for the people who prophecy was directed towards.
And this part of it here is not only towards Israel, but to the rest of the world and the nations, that judgment day is coming and God's will be done. And you better have your ducks in a row, because God's will be done. So can this message bring us comfort today? Pardon?
It's hearing.
Either one, depending on which side of the fence you're on, right? It can bring you comfort because you know God's still in control. When he says, who's going to bring me down from the mountains? I will. But at the end of it is a redemption for those that are on the right side. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Prophecy books always bring about principle and truth. So it proves what God says because he says it and it comes about. Remember, he said, if a prophet says something that does not come about, on that day he shall die. So these things had to come about for these guys to be the prophet. So first it was declared. First, a warning was issued. This is what's going to happen. And in many cases, if you do not change your ways, as in the next book over Jonah, that's what they were told. If you don't change your ways, this is what's going to happen. Well, the prophets were put into a position of saying, this is what the Lord says is going to happen to these guys, but you must take note of what he's saying as well.
So that you don't go into the same boat. Exactly. Exactly. Other thoughts or comments? It'd be that time, so thank you very much.